Some Hollywood love stories fade with time. Others become so legendary that people remember only the happy photographs, the red carpet smiles, and the unforgettable movie moments. But behind one of Hollywood's most beloved marriages was a heartbreak that lasted far longer than the public ever realized. For decades after Gilda Radner's death, Gene Wilder rarely spoke in detail about the darkest chapters of their life together. When he finally did, through interviews, public appearances, and the deeply personal pages of his memoir, he revealed a story that was far more complicated than the fairy tale many fans believed. It wasn't simply the story of losing the woman he loved. It was a story filled with unanswered medical questions, overwhelming guilt, sleepless nights beside a hospital bed, and a promise that would shape the rest of his life. Even years later, Gene admitted there were moments he replayed endlessly in his mind. Could anything have been done differently? Could someone have recognized a warning sign sooner? Those questions never completely disappeared. To understand why Gene carried that weight for so many years, we have to begin long before the hospital rooms and heartbreaking diagnoses. We have to go back to the woman who made millions laugh before she ever made them cry. Born in Detroit in 1946, Gilda Radner grew up in a comfortable household where humor quickly became her favorite language. She discovered early that making people laugh could brighten a room, ease tension, and create connections that word alone sometimes couldn't. Friends remembered her as energetic, imaginative, and endlessly curious, someone who could transform an ordinary conversation into a performance without even trying. But behind her cheerful personality was a young girl who quietly battled insecurity. She later spoke openly about struggling with her weight as a child and feeling different from many of her classmates. Instead of letting those experiences silence her, she developed an extraordinary ability to laugh at herself before anyone else could. What began as a defense mechanism gradually evolved into one of the defining qualities of her comedy. As she entered adulthood, acting slowly replaced every other career ambition. After leaving the University of Michigan before graduating, she moved to Toronto, where improvisational theater introduced her to a generation of future comedy legends. Every performance sharpened her instincts, teaching her how to create unforgettable characters from ordinary human quirks. Those years eventually led her to one of the biggest opportunities in television history. In 1975, producer Lorne Michaels assembled the original cast for a bold new late-night sketch show that few expected would become a cultural phenomenon. Before long, Saturday Night Live introduced America to Gilda Radner alongside a remarkable group of young comedians. She wasn't simply funny. She was fearless. Whether portraying the endlessly confused Emily Littello or the wildly unpredictable Roseanne Rosenadana, Gilda committed herself completely to every character. Audiences believed every expression, every awkward pause, every outrageous misunderstanding. Critics praised her remarkable ability to balance absurd comedy with genuine vulnerability, making even the strangest characters feel surprisingly human. Within only a few years, she had become one of television's brightest comedy stars. Yet professional success didn't automatically bring personal happiness. The pressures of constant performing, demanding schedules, and life in the public eye left little room for emotional stability. Friends later described Gilda as someone who loved deeply but also worried deeply. She often questioned herself even while audiences adored her. Then, in the early 1980s, a film project changed everything. While working on Hanky Panky, she met Gene Wilder. By then, Gene was already one of Hollywood's most recognizable actors. Audiences knew him from unforgettable performances in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, Blazing Saddles, and Young Frankenstein. Quiet, thoughtful, and famously private, he seemed very different from Gilda's energetic personality. Yet almost immediately, something unusual happened. People working on the film noticed a chemistry between them long before either actor publicly acknowledged it. Their conversations lasted longer than rehearsals required. Their laughter continued after cameras stopped rolling. Even crew members sensed that what was developing between them was more than professional admiration. The timing, however, made everything complicated. Both were involved in other relationships, and neither had expected to find themselves falling in love. Years later, Gene admitted that the beginning of their romance wasn't simple or comfortable. It forced both of them to make painful decisions that affected other people, something they never tried to erase from their memories. Rather than pretending their relationship began perfectly, Gene eventually acknowledged its complicated beginning with unusual honesty. Despite those challenges, their connection only grew stronger. Friends described them as inseparable. They shared an unusual sense of humor, loved quiet evenings away from Hollywood, and seemed to understand each other's insecurities without needing many words. For the first time in years, Gilda appeared genuinely at peace. Neither of them could have imagined that the happiest chapter of their lives was already racing toward a tragedy neither love nor fame could prevent. By 1984, Gene Wilder and Gilda Radner had stopped worrying about what Hollywood expected of them. After navigating difficult personal changes and choosing a future together, they married during an intimate ceremony in the south of France. There were no extravagant headlines or over-the-top celebrations. It was exactly the kind of wedding that reflected who they were, deeply personal, quietly joyful, and focused on the life they hoped to build together. Friends noticed something different about Gene almost immediately. For years, he had developed a reputation as one of Hollywood's most private actors. He rarely revealed much about his personal life and often preferred peaceful afternoons over celebrity parties. Yet around Gilda, that reserve softened. He laughed more easily, smiled more often, and appeared genuinely relaxed in a way many of his longtime friends had rarely witnessed. Gilda often described Gene as someone who made her feel safe, not because he solved every problem, but because he listened. She had spent years performing for audiences, creating larger-than-life characters and making millions laugh every Saturday night. At home, she no longer felt she needed to perform. She could simply be herself. Gene later admitted that those quiet moments became some of his most treasured memories. Morning coffee together, long walks through the countryside, conversations that lasted well into the night. Simple routines that most couples hardly notice eventually became the memories he would treasure the most. The couple settled into a historic Connecticut home, hoping to create something Hollywood rarely offered, an ordinary family life. They dreamed about having children. They imagined growing old together. Like countless newlyweds, they assumed they had decades ahead of them. Neither realized how quickly everything was about to change. Professionally, they also enjoyed working together. Their chemistry on screen reflected the affection they shared away from the cameras. Audiences responded warmly to films like The Woman in Red and later Haunted Honeymoon. Their playful interactions never felt forced because they weren't acting out an imaginary relationship. They were simply bringing pieces of their real partnership onto the screen. Crew members frequently remarked that the pair treated everyone with kindness. They weren't interested in celebrity status or elaborate entourages. They preferred laughing with crew members between takes and keeping the atmosphere light, even during long filming days. Looking back, many who worked with them remembered those productions as unusually happy sets. No one knew they were watching the final carefree months of Gilda's life. During the filming of Haunted Honeymoon in England, subtle changes began appearing. At first, they seemed almost impossible to notice. Gilda complained about unusual exhaustion. Her legs often ached after work. She felt bloated and increasingly uncomfortable, but everyone, including Gilda herself, assumed the demanding filming schedule was taking its toll. Actors frequently worked long hours under stressful conditions. Fatigue wasn't unusual. Still, something felt different. Gene later recalled that Gilda kept insisting her body didn't feel right. She couldn't always explain why, but she sensed something was changing. At first, they tried to remain optimistic. Perhaps she simply needed rest. Maybe it was a lingering virus or the result of constant travel. Doctors initially offered reassuring explanations. Stress, fatigue, minor digestive problems. Nothing immediately suggested a life-threatening illness. Those answers brought temporary comfort, but the symptoms refused to disappear. Instead, they became harder to ignore. Weeks turned into months. The pain intensified. Simple daily activities became exhausting. The woman whose boundless energy had once filled television studios now struggled through ordinary routines. Gene watched helplessly as each appointment ended with another uncertain explanation. Different specialists suggested different possibilities. Some believed emotional stress explained her condition. Others recommended rest, medication, or additional observation. Each new opinion delayed the search for a more serious answer. Years later, Gene spoke openly about the frustration those months created. He admitted that he trusted medical advice because he wanted desperately to believe nothing catastrophic was happening. Looking back, he often wondered whether they should have pushed harder, asked more questions, or demanded more extensive testing sooner. Those reflections became one of the most painful parts of his later interviews. Finally, After months of worsening symptoms, doctors performed more comprehensive examinations. The results changed everything. The diagnosis was ovarian cancer, not an early stage, not a condition caught before it had spread. By the time the disease was identified, it had already advanced significantly. The word seemed impossible to accept. Only months earlier, the couple had been discussing future film projects, family plans, and holidays together. Now every conversation centered on surgery, chemotherapy, and survival. Jean later described that moment as the instant life divided into two separate chapters. There was everything that happened before the diagnosis, and everything that followed. Nothing would ever feel ordinary again. The diagnosis arrived like a storm that neither Jean nor Gilda had seen coming. Until that moment, every hopeful explanation had allowed them to believe life would eventually return to normal. Instead, they were suddenly facing one of the most aggressive forms of cancer, and doctors explained that treatment needed to begin immediately. For Jean, the shock wasn't only hearing the word cancer. It was learning how much time had already been lost. He later admitted that he kept replaying the previous months in his mind, remembering every doctor's appointment, every reassuring conversation, and every moment they had been told not to worry. Those memories would haunt him long after Gilda was gone. Surgery became the first major step. The operation was far more extensive than either of them had expected. Doctors discovered the disease had spread beyond its original location, forcing them to perform procedures that changed Gilda's future forever. Along with fighting for her life, she was forced to accept another heartbreaking reality. She would never be able to have children. That loss struck both of them deeply. Only a short time earlier they had imagined filling their Connecticut home with a family of their own. Now those dreams disappeared inside a single hospital room. Yet if Gilda cried, she rarely did it in front of other people. Instead, she continued trying to comfort those around her. Nurses later remembered that even during painful treatment she would crack jokes, imitate famous celebrities, or invent ridiculous characters simply to make exhausted hospital staff smile. It was the same instinct that had made America fall in love with her years earlier. Comedy remained her shield. But behind the humor, the physical battle had only just begun. Chemotherapy followed surgery. Radiation treatments came after that. Some days offered hope. Other days left her barely able to leave bed. The woman audiences remembered as energetic and fearless found herself exhausted by the smallest tasks. Her hair gradually disappeared. Her weight dropped dramatically. Food often became difficult to tolerate. There were mornings when simply standing required enormous effort. Jean watched every change unfold in front of him. He wasn't simply her husband anymore. He became her caregiver, chauffeur, advocate, companion, and emotional support all at once. Every hospital visit became part of their routine. Every encouraging conversation with doctors was balanced by private moments filled with fear neither of them fully admitted aloud. Friends occasionally visited, bringing laughter into the house whenever possible. Former castmates from Saturday Night Live checked in regularly. Hollywood colleagues offered support. But once everyone left, Jean and Gilda faced the silence together. It was during those quiet evenings that Jean later said he truly understood what love meant. Love wasn't measured by romantic holidays or glamorous premieres. It was measured by sitting beside someone through another sleepless night, holding their hand when treatments became unbearable, finding reasons to smile after another disappointing medical report. There were moments when treatment appeared to be working. Doctors cautiously used one of the most beautiful words any cancer patient hopes to hear: remission. For a brief period, Jean allowed himself to believe the nightmare might finally be ending. The couple cautiously began making plans again. They spoke about traveling. They imagined returning to normal life. Even simple conversations about tomorrow suddenly felt precious. But hope can sometimes be painfully fragile. Only a few months later, new tests revealed devastating news. The cancer had returned. This time it was even more aggressive. Jean later admitted that hearing the disease had come back was almost harder than hearing the original diagnosis. The first time, they still believed medicine could defeat it. The second time, reality became much more difficult to escape. Despite everything, Gilda refused to disappear from public life completely. Rather than hiding her illness, she made an extraordinary decision. She would speak honestly about it. She wrote openly about the physical pain, the fear, and the emotional exhaustion that accompanied treatment. She described losing her hair, enduring chemotherapy, and living through months of uncertainty without pretending to be endlessly optimistic. Her honesty encouraged countless women facing similar diagnoses to feel less alone. Gene admired that courage more than words could express. He often said Gilda possessed a remarkable gift. Even while fighting for her own life, she somehow found the strength to help complete strangers. She transformed private suffering into public awareness. And although she couldn't know it at the time, that decision would eventually save lives. Still, none of that changed what Gene witnessed every evening. When the interviews ended, when the cameras disappeared, when visitors returned home, he was left watching the strongest woman he had ever known grow weaker with every passing week. Deep inside, he feared the ending neither of them wanted to speak aloud. As Gilda's illness progressed, Gene Wilder found himself living two very different lives. To the outside world, he remained the calm, gentle actor people had admired for years. When cameras appeared or friends stopped by, he smiled, answered questions politely, and tried to reassure everyone that they were staying hopeful. But once the front door closed, reality looked very different. Their home slowly transformed into a place organized around medications, doctors' appointments, treatment schedules, and moments of cautious optimism. Every ringing telephone could bring encouraging news, or another setback. Gene later admitted that those years changed him forever. He wasn't afraid of hard work. He wasn't afraid of hospitals. He was afraid of helplessness. Watching someone you love suffer while knowing you cannot take their pain away is a burden few people truly understand. That feeling became part of his daily life. He learned how to recognize the smallest changes in Gilda's condition. Some mornings she seemed energetic enough to laugh over breakfast. Other days, simply walking across the room left her exhausted. Gene adjusted without complaint. If she wanted to sit quietly, he sat beside her. If she wanted to talk, he listened. If she wanted to laugh, he became her audience. Friends later recalled that he rarely left her side for very long. Film projects became less important. Public appearances were reduced to only those that truly mattered. His priority was no longer Hollywood. It was Gilda. Years later, Gene would reveal something that surprised many people. He admitted that there were nights when anger overwhelmed him. Not anger directed at Gilda. Not even anger directed at fate. His frustration centered on the months before her diagnosis. He couldn't stop wondering whether someone should have recognized the warning signs earlier. Could earlier testing have changed everything? Would quicker answers have given Gilda a better chance? Those questions became impossible to silence. Gene never claimed to be a doctor, nor did he pretend to know exactly what would have happened under different circumstances. But he openly acknowledged that he believed too many opportunities had been missed before the disease was finally identified. That belief stayed with him long after Gilda was gone. It became one of the greatest emotional burdens he carried. Another confession was even more personal. Gene admitted that guilt sometimes appeared from unexpected places. Their relationship had begun under complicated circumstances while both were ending previous marriages. Although they eventually built a deeply loving partnership, Gilda occasionally worried that the painful beginning of their romance somehow reflected badly on them. Gene always tried to reassure her that life was more complicated than simple ideas of punishment or fate. Still, he understood how deeply she felt everything. She often carried emotional burdens long after other people would have let them go. Looking back, Gene believed that compassion, not perfection, defined their marriage. They argued sometimes. They disagreed. They became exhausted. There were moments when fear made both of them impatient. But none of that weakened their love. If anything, surviving those difficult days together made their bond even stronger. Gene later reflected that real marriages weren't built on constant happiness. They were built on choosing each other, especially during life's hardest moments. Hospital nights became some of the most unforgettable memories of his life. Machines beeped steadily in the background. Doctors quietly entered and left the room. Nurses adjusted medication while Gene remained seated beside Gilda's bed, often refusing to leave even when encouraged to rest. Sleep became almost impossible. Every movement from Gilda caught his attention. Every new medical report brought another mixture of hope and anxiety. Those endless nights changed him in ways he rarely discussed publicly. He once admitted that grief had actually begun before Gilda died. Watching someone slowly lose their strength while still fighting with incredible courage creates a different kind of sorrow. It isn't sudden. It arrives little by little. By the time the final goodbye comes, part of your heart has already been grieving for months. Despite her worsening condition, Gilda never completely lost a remarkable sense of humor. Visitors often expected to comfort her. Instead, they frequently left laughing. She joked about hospital routines. She teased Jean whenever she caught him worrying too much. Even during treatment, she searched for reasons to smile. That resilience amazed everyone around her. Jean later said it reminded him exactly why audiences had loved her from the very beginning. Her comedy wasn't an act. It was part of who she truly was. Still, there came a moment when both of them quietly realized that courage alone could not stop the illness. The treatments became less effective. Recovery periods grew shorter. Doctors gradually shifted from discussing long-term plans to helping her remain as comfortable as possible. No one wanted to say the words aloud, but both Jean and Gilda understood what was approaching. The future they had imagined together was slipping away. And soon, Jean would face the most heartbreaking morning of his entire life. By the spring of 1989, Gene Wilder understood that every day with Gilda had become a gift. The treatments that had once offered hope were no longer producing the results everyone had prayed for. Doctors continued doing everything they could to ease the discomfort, but the disease had advanced beyond what medicine at the time could stop. Gene refused to measure their remaining days by hospital charts or medical statistics. Instead, he focused on something much simpler: being present. He stayed close whenever he could, reading to her, holding her hand, sharing quiet conversations, and reminding her of happier memories. Sometimes they spoke about their first meeting. Other times they laughed over stories from movie sets or remembered the ordinary moments that had made their marriage so meaningful. It wasn't the glamorous Hollywood memories that mattered most. It was breakfast together, walking through their garden, watching old films on quiet evenings. Those ordinary moments had become priceless. Friends who visited later said there was still warmth inside the room despite the sadness surrounding them. Gilda continued trying to comfort other people, even when she was the one fighting the greatest battle. That was simply who she was. Even as her strength faded, she remained determined not to let fear define her final days. Gene admired that courage more than he could ever express. Years later, he admitted that watching Gilda face death with dignity became one of the greatest lessons of his life. She rarely asked, "Why me?" Instead, she spent more time asking about the people around her. Were they eating enough? Had they gotten enough sleep? Were they taking care of themselves? It amazed everyone that someone carrying such enormous pain could still think first about others. As May 1989 approached, Gilda's condition worsened rapidly. There were moments when conversations became shorter because speaking required too much energy. The laughter that had once filled every room grew quieter. Gene realized that time was running out. On the 20th of May, 1989, Gilda Radner passed away at the age of 42. The news spread across the entertainment world almost immediately. Fans were stunned. Comedians who had grown up watching her felt as though they had lost a mentor. Former Saturday Night Live cast members shared emotional tributes, remembering not only her extraordinary talent, but also her kindness behind the scenes. To the public, America had lost one of its brightest comedic voices. To Gene Wilder, the loss was far more personal. He had lost his best friend. The silence inside their Connecticut home became almost unbearable. Every room reminded him of her favorite chair, the book she had been reading, small handwritten notes she had left behind. Every ordinary object suddenly carried extraordinary meaning. Gene later revealed that grief didn't arrive all at once. At first, he found himself expecting to hear her footsteps. He would instinctively think about telling her something before remembering she was gone. Those moments, he admitted, were some of the hardest. The mind often takes longer than the heart to accept reality. For months, he avoided discussing his emotions publicly. Reporters naturally wanted interviews. Television programs hoped he would speak. But Gene chose silence. Not because he wished to forget Gilda. Quite the opposite. He believed some grief was too personal to place in front of television cameras. Instead, he mourned privately, surrounded by close friends and family. Years later, when he finally began sharing more about that period, many people were surprised by his honesty. He confessed that he sometimes felt overwhelming loneliness, not simply because Gilda was gone, because she had been the one person who truly understood every part of his life. Success, failure, fear, joy. She had shared all of it. Without her, even happy moments carried sadness. Gene also acknowledged something many widows and widowers quietly experience. He feared forgetting. Not forgetting Gilda herself, but forgetting the tiny details. The sound of her laughter, the exact way she smiled before telling a joke, the expression she made when something amused her. He realized memories must be protected because time slowly softens even the sharpest recollections. So he began writing. He reflected on their years together, preserving stories that otherwise might have disappeared. Those memories eventually became part of his memoir, allowing readers to understand not only Gilda's remarkable public career, but also the loving, compassionate woman who existed away from the spotlight. Writing, Gene admitted, did not erase grief, but it helped him keep part of Gilda alive. Still, one decision he made after her passing would ensure that her legacy reached far beyond Hollywood and would help countless families facing the same heartbreaking battle. In the months following Gilda Radner's passing, Gene Wilder faced a choice that many people in his position never had to make. He could retreat from the world entirely, protecting himself from painful memories, or he could transform that grief into something that might help others. At first, the idea seemed almost impossible. Simply speaking Gilda's name in public often brought back overwhelming emotion. Interviews became difficult. Every question about her final months reopened wounds that had barely begun to heal. Yet Gene eventually realized that remaining silent would not honor the woman Gilda had been. She had spent her career making strangers feel less alone through laughter. Perhaps, he thought, her story could continue helping people in another way. One issue remained especially painful for him. He never forgot how long it had taken before doctors finally discovered Gilda's ovarian cancer. For years, Gene spoke carefully about those months. He did not claim that every outcome could have been changed, nor did he accuse individual physicians of bad intentions. Instead, he urged both the medical community and the public to pay closer attention to symptoms that were too often dismissed or misunderstood. His message was remarkably simple. Listen when patients tell you something feels wrong. Sometimes the body whispers before it screams. That belief became one of the driving forces behind the awareness campaigns he supported after Gilda's death. Gene also wanted people to remember Gilda for much more than the illness that claimed her life. Whenever he was invited to discuss her legacy, he steered conversations back to her extraordinary talent. He talked about her generosity, her endless curiosity, her ability to find humor in situations where most people would have surrendered to despair. He wanted younger generations to discover the brilliant comedian who had transformed live television, not only the courageous woman who battled cancer. Friends admired that approach. Gene never allowed tragedy to erase joy. Instead, he reminded people that Gilda's life had been filled with unforgettable achievements long before it became associated with heartbreaking headlines. One of the most meaningful developments came when Gene became deeply involved in efforts to improve support for people living with cancer. He helped establish programs dedicated to education, emotional support, and compassionate care, believing that patients deserved more than medical treatment alone. They deserved understanding. Families also needed guidance. Caregivers often carried invisible emotional burdens while trying to remain strong for loved ones. Gene knew exactly what that experience felt like because he had lived it himself. Whenever he met families facing similar struggles, he listened more than he spoke. He understood that every journey was different. Some people survived, others did not, but everyone deserved dignity. In later interviews, Gene occasionally reflected on what Gilda had taught him. He said courage was rarely loud. It wasn't dramatic speeches or grand gestures. Real courage looked like someone waking up for another difficult treatment despite overwhelming fear. It looked like smiling at nurses after a painful day. It looked like finding reasons to laugh when laughter seemed impossible. Those lessons stayed with him for the rest of his life. As the years passed, Gene gradually returned to acting, though never with the same intensity as before. His priorities had changed. Hollywood success no longer defined happiness. Peace, privacy, and meaningful relationships mattered far more. Many fans wonder why one of cinema's most beloved actors appeared less frequently on screen during the 1990s. The answer was deeply personal. Gene had discovered there were things more important than another film. He spent more time writing, reading, and enjoying a quieter life away from constant public attention. Whenever he accepted interviews, however, one subject almost always returned. Gilda. Even decades later, the affection in his voice never disappeared. He rarely described her as though she belonged only to the past. Instead, he spoke about her as someone whose influence remained part of his everyday life. He laughed while recalling her practical jokes. He smiled when remembering her unique sense of humor. And occasionally, he paused, allowing silence to finish thoughts that words could not. Those pauses revealed something audiences immediately recognized. Some forms of love never truly end. They simply change shape. Time may soften grief, but it does not erase genuine devotion. Gene had learned to live with loss. He had never learned to stop loving Gilda, and perhaps he never wanted to. Still, one final truth remained. Years after her death, Gene made an emotional admission that touched millions, a simple confession that revealed why Gilda would always remain the greatest love of his life. As the years passed, Gene Wilder became even more selective about public appearances. He wasn't trying to disappear. He simply believed that a meaningful life didn't require constant attention. While many Hollywood stars spent years chasing headlines, Gene found comfort in privacy. He devoted more time to writing, spending quiet moments with loved ones, and reflecting on a life that had brought him incredible success, but also unimaginable loss. Whenever interviewers asked about his greatest films, he happily shared stories from Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles, and Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. He enjoyed talking about the craft of acting and the friendships he had formed throughout his career. But eventually, almost every conversation found its way back to Gilda. The change in his expression was unmistakable. His voice softened. His answers became slower, more thoughtful. It wasn't because speaking about her had become easier. It was because he wanted people to remember her for the extraordinary person she had been. In one reflection, Gene explained that people often assume grief eventually disappears. He gently disagreed. According to him, grief doesn't vanish. Instead, you learn to carry it differently. Some mornings are lighter than others. Some memories bring smiles instead of tears. But the love remains. That quiet observation resonated with countless people who had experienced loss themselves. Gene never portrayed himself as someone who had moved on. He preferred another way of thinking. He had moved forward while carrying Gilda's memory with him. There was an important difference. Years after her passing, Gene also spoke about something he wished every couple understood. He encouraged people not to wait for perfect moments before expressing gratitude to those they love. Life, he said through both his words and actions, can change without warning. The conversations we postpone, the forgiveness we delay, the appreciation we assume can always be shared tomorrow. Sometimes tomorrow never arrives. That perspective didn't come from philosophy books. It came from experience. Looking back, Gene often said he had no regrets about the love he gave Gilda. If anything, he wished they had been granted more ordinary years together. More birthdays, more holidays, more peaceful evenings at home. Not glamorous events, just ordinary life. Because after loss, ordinary moments become the ones people miss most. One of the most touching aspects of Gene's later interviews was the absence of bitterness. Although he openly acknowledged the pain surrounding Gilda's delayed diagnosis and the heartbreak of losing her so young, he refused to allow anger to define the rest of his life. Instead, he focused on gratitude. Gratitude that they had found each other at all. Gratitude for the years they shared. Gratitude that millions of people continued laughing because of Gilda's work. He believed those gifts were greater than the tragedy that followed. Friends often remarked that Gene remained remarkably gentle despite everything he had endured. He treated strangers with kindness. He spoke thoughtfully. He avoided unnecessary drama. Perhaps grief had taught him something many people spend a lifetime trying to learn. That time is precious. That kindness matters. That love leaves a mark no illness can erase. As younger generations discovered Gilda through classic Saturday Night Live sketches and Gene through his timeless films, many viewers found themselves captivated not only by their individual careers but by the remarkable relationship they shared. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't free from hardship, but it was genuine. And perhaps that's why their story continues to resonate decades later. Gene's greatest tribute to Gilda wasn't a speech. It wasn't a movie. It wasn't even a book. It was a way he continued speaking about her with affection, honesty, and unwavering respect. He never allowed fame to turn their relationship into mythology. Instead, he described a real marriage between two imperfect people who loved each other deeply and faced life's greatest challenge together. That honesty may be the most powerful legacy he ever shared. Because in the end, Gene Wilder's story wasn't simply about losing the love of his life. It was about proving that real love doesn't end when someone is gone. It continues in memories, in acts of kindness, in the lives that are changed because their story was told. And for Gene, every interview, every heartfelt recollection, and every effort to honor Gilda carried the same quiet message. She was never forgotten. As the years went on, Gene Wilder gradually stepped away from Hollywood. To many fans, it seemed surprising. He was still respected, still admired, and still capable of delivering unforgettable performances. Yet he no longer felt the need to remain at the center of the entertainment world. The applause that had once defined success no longer held the same meaning. His priorities had changed forever. Peace had become more valuable than fame. Privacy mattered more than publicity. And the memories he carried of Gilda Radner became one of the most important parts of his life. Whenever people recognized him in public, many naturally wanted to talk about Willy Wonka, Young Frankenstein, or his unforgettable comedy partnership with Richard Pryor. Gene appreciated those conversations. But when someone mentioned Gilda, his response was always different. There was warmth in his smile, there was gratitude in his voice, and there was a quiet sadness that never completely disappeared. Those who interviewed him often noticed that he never referred to Gilda as though she was simply a chapter that had ended. Instead, he spoke of her as someone whose influence remained present in the way he viewed life. Her optimism, her courage, her compassion, those qualities stayed with him long after she was gone. In later years, Gene also reflected on the extraordinary reaction from people who had never even met Gilda personally. Fans wrote thousands of letters describing how her comedy had helped them through depression, loneliness, illness, or difficult periods in their own lives. Some explained that they had grown up watching her on Saturday Night Live. Others had discovered her performances years later through reruns and documentaries. Many simply wanted Gene to know that Gilda's ability to make people laugh had never faded. Reading those letters brought him comfort. They reminded him that while cancer had taken Gilda's life far too soon, it had not taken away the joy she created. That joy continued spreading from one generation to the next. Gene often believed that was the greatest measure of a person's legacy. Not awards, not box office records, not celebrity status, but the lasting impact they leave on ordinary people. That belief inspired him to continue supporting cancer awareness and patient advocacy for years after Gilda's death. Through speaking engagements, charitable work, and his willingness to share their story, he helped encourage conversations about recognizing symptoms, seeking medical advice when something feels wrong, and supporting families facing devastating diagnoses. He never claimed to have all the answers. Instead, he hoped that telling Gilda's story might encourage others to ask important questions sooner and to treasure the people they love every single day. In many ways, that became his final promise to her, to make sure she would be remembered not for how her life ended, but for how beautifully she lived. When Gene Wilder passed away in 2016, countless tributes celebrated his extraordinary career. Yet among the many films, awards, and unforgettable performances, one theme appeared again and again. People remembered the love story he shared with Gilda Radner. Not because it was perfect, not because it escaped heartbreak, but because it revealed something deeply human. Their marriage showed that love is not measured by how many years two people spend together. It is measured by how completely they stand beside one another through life's greatest joys and greatest sorrows. Decades after Gilda's passing, Gene's reflections never sounded like someone chasing sympathy. They sounded like a husband honoring the woman who had forever changed his life. Perhaps that is why his words continue to resonate. In an industry often associated with temporary relationships and fleeting fame, Gene and Gilda left behind